Milton
with our next installment of Tailgate University. And like with the last time you could see the tailgate, this time we're using it to lean on so you can see behind us what we're going to be talking about. And the topic of the day is pasture recovery. I don't know about y'all, but I think lots of farmers in the East Tennessee area are probably struggling with figuring out what am I going to do with the area that's been torn up this winter while we were feeding hay. We've got lots of mud, lots of bare ground, and we've got to find a way to take care of that so we don't end up with a breeding ground for weeds.
That's correct. And one of the first things we've got to be able to do, we've got to concentrate on, is getting those animals out of this area. It is going to be impossible to put any kind of forage in here while the animals are on the pasture. So Sarah, one of the things that we've got to do is be able to isolate these areas where we fed and had high concentrations of cattle. And that's as simple as a single strand of poly wire with some electricity on it to keep those animals out of there.
Right, exactly. Because the animals are what have torn up this ground all winter long. If we don't remove them, we're not doing ourselves any favor. So once we get those animals out, the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to level that ground up some, because we all know once it dries out, we've got tractor ruts, we've got footpaths, and all of those things we're going to want to smooth up because we don't want to have that same rough ground as we move on into the spring, the rest of the spring and in the summertime. So you could come in with a harrow, with a disc, something along that line, and just kind of smooth that ground up, whatever that piece of equipment needs to be for you.
We're not really talking about working this ground up like we would for a row crop of some sort, like tobacco or hemp or something like that. We're just talking about stirring the soil enough to get it smooth so that we can travel over it without those ruts and keep that water from seeking one path as it moves off of there and causing erosion as well.
Right.
So there's a lot of different options once we get this smoothed down that we could look at. The thing is, if we're going to use this area again next winter to feed on or to congregate animals on, it doesn't make much sense to try to establish a cool season grass like fescue or orchard grass or something of that nature for two reasons. Number one, we're going to destroy it, and it's an expensive crop for a little bit of yield that first year. The second thing is that these cool season grasses are not going to establish well as we move on into the summer. With shallow root systems, we're going to see them start to die out. So we have to look at plants that like this hot weather. And some of those are?
Some of those are going to be your summer annuals, things like sorghum Sudan grass, pearl millet, crabgrass, anything along those lines are going to be great crops to come back in. Now we are going to talk here in just a little bit about two different methods. One of those is going to be primarily the summer annuals, and then there's another approach that could be more of a perennial approach if you manage it correctly, right?
That is correct. And again, I can hear people groaning whenever we talk about things like crabgrass and Bermuda grass and things like that, because we spent our life trying to get those out of tobacco patches and gardens and row crop fields and that type of thing. But again, we're looking at producing some type of forage to make this ground productive over the summer. So if we look at things like sorghum Sudan hybrids, commonly called Sudex, we could look at seeding these areas and then control grazing them. That same fence that limits access into this can also be the gateway to come in and mob graze it and move those animals back out, allowing it to regrow. So things like sorghum Sudan hybrids, which are going to grow really fast, we have a couple of things we need to be concerned about. Number one, in times whenever these plants are really stressed, either by drought or by lack of sunlight and the inability to grow, they can be high in nitrates. They can also have a prussic acid issue if stressed as well. So to manage those things, we test for those nitrates before we graze or cut it for hay. And on the prussic acid, we want to make sure that's at least 20 inches high before we do any type of grazing on that. If we look at some of our other options out here, there's a lot of native warm seasons. If we're not going to be using this for a feeding ground next year, we could establish native warm season grasses. They're really slow to establish, but they are prolific producers of forage. But if we come back in and try to feed on top of them again next year, we're going to be faced with the same issue that we've got here. whenever we look at things like crabgrass, we've got a couple of different options there. Even though most of the time we're trying to kill crabgrass, there are some really good forage varieties like Red River crabgrass out there that we could establish. And if we allow those to go to seed right before frost and right before we start feeding, then we can actually reseed for a partial crop come next year.
That way it's less management on the producer's part. You'll have a little bit of forage coming back. You may have to do some additional amendments the next spring if you choose to feed in the same place, but you're not as far behind the eight ball as you were when you started.
The big thing is to have a plan. Know what you're going to do. Think about it ahead of time and be planning all winter as to how we're going to repair this and make it a productive part of your farm for next year. We all have these areas. It's not a matter of management versus non-management that causes these areas. It's impossible to feed on cool season grass stand without getting this kind of problem that we see here behind us. But by smoothing this down, having a plan, we can make this productive throughout the summer.
It helps fill that cool season forage slump, and it also helps take the stress off those cool season grasses in other parts of your farm as well.
That's exactly right. Whenever the animals are grazing here, they're allowing your cool season grasses, fescue mainly, to recover and get some growth on them so that we're not constantly overgrazing those during the summer as well.
If this is an option that you want to take on your farm and you have questions about seeding rates and time of year, that's something you can reach out to your local extension office about. I know both Dad, Milton, and I are more than happy to help with anything along those lines at any time. You can reach out to us on Facebook, by email, or phone call at either one. And we thank you for tuning in to the last version of Tailgate University.
Thank you.
Thanks.